Welcome to The Lion Within Us, a podcast serving Christian men who are hungry to be the leaders God intends you to be. I'm your host, Chris Granger. Let's jump in. All right, guys, it's your meat episode. I'm excited to be here with you. Let's get right into it, okay? So the scripture of the week this week is in the book of Romans, chapter 12, verse 2. It says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So, guys, go back and listen to the spiritual kickoff episode. It just should be in the last one in your feed, okay? I'll unpack this at length to give you an idea of how you can simplify and apply this into your life, all right? So now, I'm excited about this one. This is just a fun episode. I brought in a friend, Marty Rind. He's from a small town in western Illinois called Aledo, and we talk a lot about first century youth ministry. And what does that look like? You know, how were the first century disciples? How do they differ from today? And Marty, you know, he has a very interesting story. Started following Christ when he was 15. His youth pastor had such an influential part of his life, and since he graduated, he's leaned into it now. He's a paid staff member at a church, leading youth. He went to Lincoln Christian University. He has a bachelor's degree in youth and family ministry, and he is just doing some incredible stuff. And he shares his story of how he went to Israel and how it really just opened his eyes to the Bible in a whole new way, what he hadn't even considered before. So it was a ton of fun just working with Marty, just hearing his passion. I think just one thing that really stood out to me is the passion he has for the Word of God, and how he's taking that now and applying it back to his teaching. So the teaching that he's doing with his kids. So lots of good insights here, lots of wisdom and discernment. Maybe the Old Testament is intimidating to you. Marty gives some very practical ways how you can approach it. And really for me, I learned a ton. He's a fun guy, young, just great to see a young man like Marty that is just leaning into his faith and doing what God's called him to do. So you're going to enjoy this one, I know, just because his energy is through the roof. I had a lot of fun with him. So enjoy this conversation with my friend, Marty Rind. Well, Marty, welcome to The Lion Within Us. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing good. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing very good. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be a fun one for sure. And speaking of fun, man, tell me something fun about you that maybe not many people know about.
So I love cats. It's weird. Some people are not cat people. I have 2 cats, which is it's one more than I'd probably prefer to have, because I got one. Both were rescue. The first one was dropped off at one of my students, actually her aunt's house, and I got this kitten. She's awesome. She actually listens to me. And then I got this other kitten from another woman in church, and he doesn't listen to me. And
Right.
You just never know. I never know what I'm going to come home to in terms of like what he's gotten into. The drawers open and messes and things.
Oh yeah. Well, you know, we have some barn cats, and then we have one cat in the house. But mainly, I grew up a dog person, so you don't find many cat guys. So that's I don't hear you, bud. Just be you, right?
Yeah, that's right. I love it.
Well, it's funny how we got connected. So my buddies at the Jewish Road podcast, we enjoyed having those guys on, and Matt's just a good buddy of mine as well. But he had, you know, Heather on the show unpacking the first century youth ministry, and I reached out to her, and she's like, well, you got to talk to Marty, because he actually he was part of the first century youth ministry, some things we've done. I was like, well, great, perfect. So that kind of led us to just this conversation today. And maybe for the listeners out there, just kind of, if you would, unpack a little bit about what the first century youth ministry is first and foremost, and then we'll just go from there.
So my connection with Heather, she was my youth pastor in high school. And after I graduated, I became a small group leader in the youth ministry at my church. And basically from there, like our relationship just kind of grew more into a friendship. Right. And then back in 2020, she contacted me that she's writing this book called First Century Youth Ministry. And she ended up, I bought a copy. And I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. First century youth ministry, like, it sounds different.
Yeah.
But she sent me a copy, and I read it in one day. Now, it's not a long book, but it was so interesting because a lot of what she includes in the book is stories about discipleship, about basically how Jesus would have led his disciples in that first century context.
Yep.
And then, like, that spawned this whole ministry of hers, first century youth ministry, where she has done she's done online classes, cohorts, which I've been a part of. There was one, it was a parables cohort. We would look at parables that Jesus tells, like, how would those have communicated things to a first century audience? And it just blew my mind. I'm like, I never thought of it like this before. These different parables, and just seeing it in a different light. And then, so I did a couple of those cohorts with her, and I remember specifically the parables one. But then a couple of years ago, she approached me. It was funny. So it was 2022, summer of 2022. I was getting ready to get on a plane to go on a mission trip to Mexico. And she sends me this Facebook message saying, hey, we're thinking of going to Israel next year. Are you interested? And I'm like, kind of bad timing, but as a short answer, yeah, but I'm about to go to Mexico. So send me the stuff. I'll get back with you in a few weeks. And so she sent me the stuff. And when I got back from Mexico, I looked it over and I'm like, this sounds incredible. Like, I really want to do this. And so it was a 2-week trip. I got approved from the church to give me permission to leave for 2 weeks. And it was, the trip, it blows your mind, really. When you take into context, put all of Jesus's teachings into context, and not even just Jesus's teaching, but the Old Testament stuff too.
Sure.
I remember having a Zoom call with Heather after the fact. Our group, because there's a group of us that were all connected with Heather through First Century Youth Ministry. We had a Zoom call afterwards, just as kind of like an after trip reflection, like, what did you learn? What are some takeaways? Things like that, just to connect a little bit there. And so the trip was a year ago, August. So, like, the last couple weeks here, we're towards the end of August here, on my Facebook memories, all these things from Israel, I've been popping up on Facebook memories. And so we're at the end of August, and I was working on lessons for youth group for the fall, because that's just something I try to stay ahead of with youth group lessons. Makes my life a little easier. And so I told her one of the things that really shifted in my teaching was that typically I would be very New Testament heavy in my teaching. I was a very direct person. You have Paul's letters, like, do this, do that, this is true, and all this stuff. I'm like, that's what I would use. And then after going to Israel, I'm like, there's so much in the Old Testament now that, like, now every time I put together a lesson for youth group, I'm like, what's an Old Testament story? What's a passage in the Old Testament that I can use for this? Because I feel so much better equipped to teach from it, that I understand it more. And there's so much that I learned in Israel that I can use. That I love teaching my students about this, because I learned so much on this trip to Israel.
Hey, man, I think, just for me, so I've had the opportunity to teach kids for the last year at our church. And one thing that just was blessed was the basis of the fundamentals that I've been teaching are all Old Testament. And every week, though, I still make the tie. I try to make the tie to, something in the New Testament based off the principle that we've learned in the Old Testament. But man, I know this is what Matt and Ron at Jewish Road, they're really big about. The Jewish culture, they ignore the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Many, Protestant Christians, we just look at New Testament. We're not spending time in the Old Testament that we should. So hats off to you for making that effort to go back, because it's a 2-part play, and we need to understand all of it to really, see the beauty of it unfold.
Yeah, I actually earlier this year, so I get to preach in big church every so often, and so earlier this year I got to preach, and the name of the sermon, because it was about like we get so stuck in the New Testament, and there's some good things in that. Of course, you have Jesus,
Right.
but the name of the sermon, the title was "Are You Stuck in Act 2?" So are you stuck in the New Testament because there's gold in the Old Testament that we so often miss or just skip over, because we think, oh, that's not for us, or that doesn't really matter to us because we got Jesus now. It's like, no, there's like a lot of what Jesus said is based off of the Old Testament, and even some of the things that Paul says in his letters come from the Old Testament, because Paul was a Pharisee, and so he's going to have the Old Testament in mind every time he writes something.
That's right. Yeah, I'm listening to a sermon series now. The guy's working through the book of Revelation. It's going to take him about a year to work through it. Mm-hmm. And one thing that really stands out every time he goes into his sermons is like, look, most people, when they read anything New Testament, particularly Revelation, they have the book of Revelation on one hand, and they have Twitter or the news feed up and trying to make the connections right. He's like, and the big difference, guys, is Paul, not Paul, John wrote this from Revelation to the first century audience. Mm-hmm. They would have read the book of Revelation with the Old Testament in their other hand, right? Yeah. And he's saying that's the big difference. And I'm like, when he's making those connections to me, I'm like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And now you're really making an intentional effort there. So man, just keep leaning into that. That's incredible.
Yeah. I had a little side note. When I was in college, I went to Lincoln Christian University in Illinois. Okay. And one of the classes, it was like one of the last classes I took, is called Senior Seminar on the Bible. I don't know exactly why it was called that, but it was basically just a 16-week class on the book of Revelation. And there were two teachers. One was the New Testament teacher that he taught New Testament 1 and 2. He taught Greek, those classes. The other was the Old Testament professor who taught Old Testament 1 and 2 in Hebrew. And I was in the Old Testament teacher's class. And I remember, I think it was on day one or day 2. He's like, Revelation is my favorite Old Testament book in the New Testament because there's so many allusions that John uses. It was so incredible. I loved that class, reading it in a different way.
There's so many ties directly to the book of Exodus. I mean, it's incredible when you start really sitting down unpacking it. But when we even jumped in a little fast, Marty, so tell us a little about your story too, bud. So, I mean, it sounds like you're in the ministry now, but, tell us a little bit about how you came to know Christ and, where you're from. So let the listeners get to know you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I grew up in a small town, Aledo, Illinois. About 3,700 people, about 20 miles east of the Mississippi River. If listeners know where the Quad Cities are, about 40 minutes south of the Quad Cities there in Illinois, small town. And so I grew up going to church. Our family, we went to church every week. And I knew the stories. I tell people I was your prototypical Sunday school kid. Like I knew the answers. I knew the stories. If there was like a trivia day in Sunday school, people were like, I want Marty on my team because I knew the answers. But the problem was I didn't know, like I didn't connect it really to my life. I knew that Jesus died for me, but I didn't like, why does that matter to me? Other than, you get to go to heaven.
So you had the head knowledge.
And so, yeah, exactly. I had head knowledge and not heart knowledge. And that didn't help when I got into junior high. I started getting bullied a lot. I dealt with depression on a very real level. And it was a struggle. It really was. And we got a youth pastor my 7th grade year that I just did not like. He was also my basketball coach, which did not help. And that was the only time in my life and my brother's life that we just stopped going to youth group because we did not like him. And it was a really dark time in my life. Now, I'm grateful that youth pastor was only there for about a year. And then we got a new youth pastor. His name was Jeremiah. And he changed everything for me. He helped me connect the dots. He invested in me, and he was instrumental in me becoming a Christian. I gave my life to Christ when I was 14 there in 8th grade. And from that point on, I'm like, I want to live for Jesus. Whatever that looks like, I want to live for Jesus because he's gotten me through. I can see he's gotten me through these hard times in my life. And he's placed at that time Jeremiah in my life to help me through this. And I was so sad when Jeremiah left at the end of my sophomore year. Him and his wife, who's also a children's pastor, they decided to move down to Louisville. Jeremiah was going to go back to seminary and finish his schooling there. And so then enter Heather. Heather became the youth pastor after Jeremiah.
Okay.
And I was I'm not going to lie, I was a little skeptical. I'm like, man, Jeremiah was so great. I don't know Heather very well. Now, Heather grew up in the same town, but she graduated the same year that our family moved there in 2002. And so I didn't really know Heather. This is 2010 or 2011. But she was such a great teacher and such a great leader. And she was so instrumental in my discipleship in my last 2 years of high school and heading into college. And so when I I went to college with the initial plan to become a high school math teacher. I love math. People think that I'm weird for liking math, but I don't care. And so I went to community college for 2 years there in the Quad Cities. And so I was a small group leader, junior high small group leader for the youth group at our home church for Heather. And that was so much fun. It was crazy because junior high boys they're a special kind of people. I'll put it that way. But I had so much fun. I learned and grew so much in those 2 years of leading those kids. And then I moved to Normal, Illinois, which is the real name of a real city.
The name is Normal. Okay.
The name is Normal. And I'll tell you, my mom loved that I lived there because every time I'd come home, she's like, okay, I guess you got to go back to normal. I'm like, that's a stupid joke, but whatever. But anyways, so I went there to finish my degree in math education at Illinois State. And I lasted one semester there and I'm like, this is not for me. And it was at that point when God kind of opened my eyes. I'm like, I've loved serving in the youth ministry. I love teaching kids the Bible. And so that's when I decided I need to go into youth ministry. And so I learned about Lincoln Christian University at 40 minutes down the road from Normal. So I transferred there, moved there, and just loved learning there at Lincoln. And then I had to do an internship. And Heather invited me to do my internship with her. And she put me to work. I'll tell you, I grew more in my leadership and just ability to be a youth pastor in that one summer with her than I did, I think, in all my time at Lincoln. Because she put me in charge of so much. And it was awesome and had a lot of fun. And then that led to my senior year at Lincoln. I served as part-time youth pastor at Heather's twin sister's church, Andrea. She reached out to me, and so I was able to serve there for a year, my senior year, and then right out of college. So I graduated in May of 2018, and I got this job here at Roskilde Church of Christ here in Lima, Ohio, and I've been here ever since, and it's been awesome.
Wow. So, but your discipleship journey, it sounds like really Jeremiah was instrumental. And I'm curious, what did, actually before that, let's take our break and then we're going to get back and we're going to unpack that together. So we'll be right back, guys.
In a world full of noise, finding your purpose requires strength, focus, and unwavering faith. At The Lion Within Us, our community is more than just a place. It's a brotherhood of Christian men committed to being the leaders God intends you to be. Here, you'll find the support you need to face life's challenges, grow stronger in your faith, and become equipped to face the battle that you're in. Stop waiting for tomorrow. Your 30-day free trial is the first step in your discipleship journey. Join us today at thelionwithin.us. That's thelionwithin.us, and start living with His purpose.
So Marty, you mentioned that Jeremiah was huge in kind of getting you started around with your discipleship journey. He leaned in, he invested that time.
Mm-hmm.
What did that look like? Because we talk about this a lot on the Lion as well for a Christian man. We need to be leaning in. We need to be being the mentors and coming alongside to build up the next generation. I'm curious for you with your experience with him. Then we can talk definitely about Heather with you as well. Mm-hmm. But what did that initially look like?
So you might hear the term incarnational ministry or incarnational youth ministry, where like you spend time with kids, with the students, you pour into them. And so Jeremiah, I mean, he spent so much time with us. He made us the focal point of his life, or at least that's what it seemed at my perspective. There was never a time where we would go to the church and he'd take time to talk with us. There's never a time. I remember times me and my brother and some friends, we'd be going on a walk. We'd walk past Jeremiah's house and we just stop by and say hi. And like, he never turned us down.
Right. It was never inconvenience or anything like that to him.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, he understood us and he listened to us, and he was so good at getting on our level, but at the same time challenging us in our faith and in our growth. But just that time that he spent with us was so different than anything I'd ever experienced in church. And so just knowing that he was invested in me mattered a great deal to me. And so that's what I try to do with my students now, is what are opportunities that we get to spend time together? How can I serve my students in that way?
Yeah.
And so a lot of what he did, I try to emulate in how I lead my youth ministry now in the relationship aspect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's, and if you think about just Jesus and his discipleship, it was all about the relationship with them. I mean, he was doing life with them 24/7. And, sometimes we think the relationship from a church leader should just be, they just bring the message and versus no, the bigger part of being a pastor, like you've been called to do, is to come alongside, to teach, to equip, to do life with them. So I mean, that's just really encouraging to hear. And now, did Heather have the same type of approach with hers? I mean, it sounds like she was very engaged in the ministry. I'm just curious, how did that look different with her?
So with Heather, it changed a bit. So with Jeremiah, our youth group was pretty small. It was 10, 15 kids. It never grew a whole lot. But the community that we had there was so great. Now with Heather, when Heather came along, she was able to connect with the schools. We saw a lot of growth in the youth ministry and ultimately in the church during Heather's tenure. And so the dynamics of it changed. The relationships really didn't. And so with Heather, I was never, like, during those 2 years where I was a student, I was never exceptionally close with Heather, but it was kind of designed that way because we had so many students. So Heather broke us up into small groups. I was a small group leader when I graduated. And so my small group leader was a guy named Jordan. And Jordan, I can't remember his last name, and I feel terrible for that. But Jordan did a lot with our small group. I remember we did a camp out one time. There was this pond out in the country that he knew when he was in high school that we'd go to and go swimming at. We went shooting one time. Like, we did events as a small group. And that was always a lot of fun, connecting with the other students in that way. So the discipleship and the relationships were still there with Heather. It just looked a little different because of the growth, which is fantastic. Whereas, with Jeremiah, I mentioned 10 to 15 kids. Heather, I remember when I was there on internship, she said that she had upwards of 60 or 70 kids each week between junior high and high school. And so it's just that growth, it changed the dynamics of it. But the discipleship, the relationships were still just as important, if not more so, with Heather there. It just looked a little different.
Right. I'm curious. So, I mean, Is that what is an effective number for you? And when you look at so far as the number of people that you can effectively disciple, you mentioned they had 60. She had to get people to help. What's a good number that you feel like as a healthy number for someone to try to come? Or is there a number? I'm just curious. What does that look like for you when you're thinking through the mechanics of building a ministry like that?
So, I've heard 2 rules of thumb.
Okay.
For youth pastors. Maybe 3. One is like 5 kids per leader. One is 10 kids per leader. And then there's also the aspect of looking at Jesus and his disciples. There's 1 adult per 12 students.
Right.
And then you also have the dynamic of Peter, James, and John, where there were 3 students that Jesus spent extra they were there at the Mount of Transfiguration.
Right.
He invited them into the room to heal this one person's daughter. Like there were certain events where it was just those 4. And so I typically try to stick that 10 to 1. Now I've got a great team of volunteers here that, our youth ministry, it's not huge. It's growing. It's been awesome. But it's not, we're a pretty small country church.
Right.
And so it's not big, but just because it's small doesn't mean that people shouldn't be involved.
Right. Right.
I can't stress that enough. I remember Heather telling me one time that there was a research done. I forget who did it, Barna or somebody. Or no, it was by Sticky Faith. Sticky Faith, it was a book written years ago where they said that if a student has 5 connections in the church, then they are exponentially more likely to stay connected to the church after they graduate high school.
With 5.
With 5. Now just having more than one, but the key is having more relationships, more connection to the church. My biggest fear, and something I struggled with when I first got here, was I was the guy. I was the person that these kids were connected to in terms of the church. There wasn't a whole lot of other people that were connected to the youth ministry. And so that was something that I need to fix quick. Because it's a terrible statistic that upwards of 70% of students leave the church after high school because they don't feel like they belong there. They don't have a role there. They're the students, They're Marty's job. They're the youth pastor's job. It's like, no, they have a place here too.
Right. Wow.
In a world full of noise, finding your purpose requires strength, focus, and unwavering faith. At The Lion Within Us, our community is more than just a place. It's a brotherhood of Christian men committed to being the leaders God intends you to be. Here, you'll find the support you need to face life's challenges, grow stronger in your faith, and become equipped to face the battle that you're in. Stop waiting for tomorrow. Your 30-day free trial is the first step in your discipleship journey. Join us today at thelionwithin.us. That's thelionwithin.us, and start living with His purpose.
Well, let's keep digging into it, Marty. I'm curious for you with this first entry. Let's go back to the Jewish trip now. So it sounds like I'd love to know, because you said it had such a big impact on you. How much, I guess, Old Testament, study had you done prior to? What did you learn there? What did that look like? Just give us some insight to going to Israel for the first time and just the things you learned there and just what you remember most.
Oh, okay. I'll do my best here.
All right, roll with it, buddy.
Okay, so before the trip, I knew some of the stories in the Old Testament. I knew David, I knew Samuel, I knew Samson, I knew Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I knew the stories. I knew the Old Testament somewhat well. And so honestly, and now I feel so ashamed to admit this, I was having thoughts like, what if I don't learn a whole lot on this Israel trip? And that was my pride speaking.
Sure.
That is something I've had to struggle with. but I was so naive as to what I was going to experience. I'm like, will this really be worth it? And then I went. And so the way the trip worked, we were there for 2 weeks. So it was basically 12 days of teaching, more or less, when you take out travel days and time changes and all the rest of it. Excuse me. And so the way that it worked was so our leader was John. He was our rabbi for the week. And that was the model that the goal was he was our rabbi. We were his disciples. Okay. And so there are certain things of that took a little getting used to. For example, he told us right off the bat, some of you guys are going to struggle on these trips because you like control. And I'm taking all the control away from you, more or less. Because every day we would just have to follow wherever he was taking us. He wouldn't tell us where we were going. He wouldn't tell us what we were learning that day. We just have to go. Now, to me, I'm like, this is awesome. I don't got to plan a thing. I just got to get up and go. I loved it. But some people, like you just have these issues with control. You want to know what you're going to do that day. Right. But he would tell us what we needed, make sure that we had water and make sure that we were good to go. Right. But we never knew, and we just had to trust our rabbi. It was the same thing with Jesus. Was he never, and with any rabbi, you didn't know where you were going to go that day. You just had to follow your rabbi and do what he did. And the other thing that I learned was that disciples were to copy and do everything that the rabbi did. That was the goal, was to be like the rabbi. Think of in Paul. I was just writing something about this. Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:1, follow my example as I follow Christ. It was the same thing with a disciple and a rabbi. I'm going to follow the rabbi as he follows Christ. Right. And so to us, that would look like, for example, I remember the first time we failed at this. We were walking and John picks up a rock. He doesn't tell us to pick up a rock. He doesn't say anything. He just picks up a rock and we keep going. Nobody else picks up a rock. And so we get to where we're going and he looks and says, where's your rock? What do you mean? He's like, well, I picked up a rock. Where's your rock? Oh, like he told us to do what he did, but that didn't connect with us. And so from that point on, every time he picked up a rock, now there were upwards of 20 of us in this group. So we get strung out on some of these trails. And so every time you pick up a rock, you'd start yelling, hey, John picked up a rock. John picked up a rock, or John took off his shoe, because that happened once. Like just these quirky things that John would use to teach us certain things about the scripture. Yeah, it was so much fun. My favorite one, we were at En-Gedi. I think it was at En-Gedi where David hid when he was on the run from Saul. Yeah, and it was hot. It was hot every day that we were there. 90s, 100-degree temperatures. It was hot, and we were walking through En-Gedi through these rocks, and we come to this small little pool. And we stop, and John tells us the story of a rabbi that was giving a tour for these American tourists. And then when they get to this little pond there, all the tourists, they're hot, so they took off their hats and they're rubbing water on their faces and on their arms, trying to cool down. And the rabbi looks at them and is like, "That's the problem with you Americans. You dabble in what God has invited you to jump in." And this rabbi dressed in all his clothes just jumps into the pond there, the little lake there. And so John does the same thing. And I'm like, out of my way. I'm getting in next. It's hot out here. And so we all fully clothed just jump into this little pond there. And it was so fun. And then we get out and people are like, how long is it going to take for us to dry off? He's like, oh, we'll be dry by the time we get back to the bus because it was so hot and dry out there. But it was just things like that. It was so incredible and just the experience of it. Now, in terms of learning, I mean, after I got back, I'm friends with another youth pastor at a church in the Lima area, and we got together because it was into the summer, just to kind of reflect over summer. I wanted to tell him about the Israel trip. I knew he wanted to hear about the Israel trip. Yeah. And so we met for lunch. We talked for 2.5 hours, and the majority of it was me telling him about Israel stuff I learned in Israel. And I left and I'm like, I feel like I barely scratched the surface of what I learned in Israel. There's just so much. Yeah. Every day. at the beginning of a trip, we were given this notebook. So Walk the Story was who John worked for, is his ministry. We were given this notebook and to take notes in everywhere that we went, and there's locations all over Israel. So the way that it worked was we went chronologically through the Bible. So we started with Genesis and Exodus. We were in the southern part of Israel. When you read the Bible and you come across the word the Negev or the Negeb, the B and V are sometimes interchangeable, or are interchangeable. So that's the desert in southern Israel. That's where we were at for the first 3 days, learning about Genesis and Exodus and basically the wanderings in the wilderness. And then we moved north and we came to Beersheba, which is where Abraham spent time at. We saw a cistern there, and we talked about cisterns a bit, and how they were used throughout even today to store water because it doesn't rain much there. Right. And then we talked about Samson, talked about David, and eventually the last few days of the trip, we got more into Jesus's teachings in the New Testament. And every day we were going to 4 or 5 different locations. And we'd get there and John would tell us, okay, what page in your notebook is it? Where are we at here? We'd go there and he'd teach us about what happened there. And every so often he wouldn't tell us exactly where we'd go. Now sometimes it would be pretty clear as to where like when we went to Mount Carmel, famous for Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Like we knew that story. Most, if not all of us, knew the story of Mount Carmel. When we went to Bethlehem, that's where Jesus was born. That's where David grew up. But there was one time where we went, we climbed up this giant rock, and up at the top, like, okay, like a beautiful view out into the valley here, and then a beautiful view. But none of us really knew where we were at. And so John's like, I forget how he worded it, but he basically like, this is where the most famous person from the tribe of Dan lived. This was Samson's hometown. Oh, that's really cool. And there was a little sculpture of what they believe is Samson's tomb, what Samson's tomb looked like. They haven't found it yet, but they believe that this is what Samson's tomb would look like. And I don't remember the history behind it, whether it was found there, whether somebody, I don't know when it was built. Like this was, cool. And like we would have these aha moments every once in a while, like just where things would click, and it was so cool. And so so every day, just so many different things, and so trying to unload all of it would take days and days and days. When we got back, well, I'll say it this way: every time that we went someplace, this is a pretty small notebook to write all these notes in. Right. And so John told us, like, when you get back, you'll have access to all my notes that I'm teaching you from, which was great because it released pressure on us to try to write down everything that John was saying because it was impossible. Yeah. And so when we got back, so the notes are on the Walk the Story website, but you have to have the password. And in order to get the password, you have to go on the trip. Gotcha. And so he gave us the password when we got back, and pages and pages and pages of stuff. One of the things that really shocked me was the Exodus story. So, we know the story. Israel was in captivity in Egypt 400 years, and then God sends Moses, does the plagues, brings them out, and in Exodus 19, I think it's Exodus 19, they come to Mount Sinai. Now, we, in our Western thinking, typically look at the 10 Commandments and at the law as, man, that's a lot of stuff to do. Right. How do you follow all this so perfectly well? In Jewish thinking, they view Mount Sinai as a wedding between God and his people, Israel. When you compare the 10 Commandments to typical Jewish wedding vows, they're very, very similar in terms of promises made from one to the other. Right. And so to a Jewish mindset, Sinai is the wedding. The 40 years in the wilderness is the honeymoon, where they just get to spend that time with God. Right. Now, growing up, you hear about the 40 years in the wilderness. I always thought, man, they're going how much traveling are they doing? Walking every day for 40? How do they do this?
Yeah.
But we learned that they really are only recorded of camping about 40 times in those 40 years. So they're typically staying in one spot, and then they'll move and camp at another spot. But just it changed so much of my interpretation of not just that story, but how they viewed the law.
Right.
To them, it wasn't a burden.
Right.
For them, it was a sign of their relationship with God, and something so intimate that they've got this covenant with the God of the universe. And it just reframed so much of what I'd always thought. And more so this was so cool. This was so cool. We were there, it was like day 2, and we're in the Negev, we're in the middle of the desert, there's like nothing around us. And we find this, I forget what it was called, but it was a restaurant gift shop. And we stopped there to eat lunch. And while we're there, I pull out my phone just to pull out Google Maps. I'm like, I wonder where we're at here. I look and I zoom in on our location, and like just around the next rock, I hate using that but literally around the next rock was a tabernacle replica. And I go to one of the leaders, David, who he was on that trip learning from John to be able to lead his own trips. And David was actually our leader in our 3 days in Jerusalem, because John had to leave to come back to the States because his son was moving off to college. So I went to Dave and I'm like, hey, look, this is right around the corner. Like, wouldn't it be cool to see this? And he's like, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but that's where we're going after lunch. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. And so we went there, and this ministry, I can't remember the name of the ministry, but they had built a tabernacle in the same measurements as you get in Exodus. And so you can go there and visit it. And so it's got like, so it's got like the things around the outside, the borders of it, these big canvas sheets. And you go through this door, and you got the altar there, you got the bronze sea, and then you have the tent of meeting, basically. Right. And so then you go into the tent of meeting, and you've got the lampstand, the menorah on one side, you got the showbread on the other. And I was scared to ask how long that showbread had been sitting there, but it was there. And then you've got the curtain that leads into the Holy of Holies. And so we go in there, and there's the Ark of the Covenant. And I'll tell you, the Ark of the Covenant looked very different than what I pictured it to look like. It was gold. Now, it wasn't real gold. It was probably painted gold. You had the rods through the loops to help carry it. You had the cherubim on top. And this is what I always pictured it differently. I don't know why. I always pictured it like the cherubim were smaller. These things were big, and their wings would meet in the middle up top. And that was what was called the mercy seat. That was where in culture, the judge would sit to give judgment. That's where God sat in their thinking, because God dwelt in the Ark of the Covenant. And then you open up the Ark, and there were a lot of Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark jokes going on here. None of our faces melted, so that was good. But you open up the Ark, and you have the manna, you have the 2 tablets from the 10 Commandments, and you have Aaron's staff. All replicas, of course, in the Ark of the Covenant there. And one of the cool things, there were 2 really cool things from this that I took away. One was that all of the measurements and all of the things that God commanded the Israelites to build in order to worship him with the tabernacle was based on Egyptian practices. Right. Because Israel had spent 400 years in Egypt. They knew Egyptian culture probably like the back of their hand. And so when they're building it, it's like, oh, I know what this is used for. This is used to worship God. But instead of the Egyptian false gods, this is the one true God. And so like God used and we saw this at work so many times, where God would use the environment or the culture, what the people knew, to communicate something about him. Wow. And the other thing that I thought was really cool was the tabernacle sat on the outside of the tent. or on the outside of the camp. I'm sorry, outside of the camp. So you have all of Israel, and then the tabernacle is there, and nobody was allowed into the tabernacle, into that border, except for the Levites and the priests. And so nobody, unless you're a Levite or a priest, knew what was in there. They just knew that's where God lives.
Right.
And so in Scripture, it says that God would come and meet with Moses in the tent of meeting. And so, like, when that happens, I don't know, did he come down like fire? Was it a light? Whatever it was. But this event, like, you could see it. You're like, wow, like, it was just this aura of, like, that's where God lives. It was something special, and there was a mystery about it. That was just so cool. And so when they would pack up everything to keep it a secret, they'd put everything inside away and pack it up first. And then they would take down the borders and move to keep that mystery of that's where that awe aspect of that's where God lives.
That sounds incredible.
It was so cool. It was so cool.
All right, guys, we'll take a quick break, guys. We'll be right back.
Start your day with a spiritual boost with our daily spiritual kickoff. This is your daily dose of inspiration and connection with the Lion Within Us. The daily SKO is now free, giving you a powerful taste of our community. Each morning, receive a focused spiritual message that sets the tone for your day. It's your daily call to action, and it's happening live. It's designed to equip you with the strength and wisdom you need to face whatever comes your way. So whether you're new to our community or just need a daily reminder of God's Word, the Daily SKO is your gateway to a deeper spiritual journey. Join us today and start your mornings with purpose. Visit thelionwithin.us to get started. That's thelionwithin.us. We are leaning in to help you be the leader God intends you to be.
Marty, I'm curious. I mean, you're definitely on fire. You're doing some great things. When you're a teacher now, you're leading the youth. How are you seeing them grow based off your experience, the things you've learned from the Old Testament, just your opportunity to go to Israel? Just curious, how are you seeing that knowledge transfer to your students, and do they have that fire? Because it just pours out of you. I'm just curious, how that transfers to the next generation.
So I teach Sunday school and I teach youth group. When I got back, so we were doing a series on the spiritual disciplines last fall. So I mentioned I try to write lessons for youth group ahead of time, but I was worried about writing stuff before the Israel trip and then going to Israel, and then, like, how much of what I know is going to be changed. Right. And so as soon as I got back, I'm like, okay, I need to write all these lessons for the fall. And so that was kind of the point where I'm like, okay, where's an Old Testament story? How can I connect this? And using those. So, for example, one of the disciplines that we talked about was celebration. It was the last one we did right before Christmas. I'm like, it'd be perfect for Christmas celebration. It'll be great. And so what we did was we had youth group at a church family's house instead of at the church, which was very different than what we typically do. And we built what's called a I forget the Hebrew word for it, but when you talk about, like, the Festival of Tabernacles or the Festival of Booths, we built a booth. It was just a small shelter that Israel would live in. The Israelites would live in for a week during the festival and have this big party. And that was how they celebrated these festivals, or, the Festival of Booths, for example. And so trying to tie it in there. Now, unfortunately, ever since last fall, in the spring, we did a video series that I really wanted to do. The summer, I pretty much always do a video series. We've got Right Now Media, and so we use that. Summer is always kind of hit or miss with me being here to teach it. So I have other volunteers that step up. They're awesome to teach. And so just doing a video series is easier for them too. And so this fall, I'm really digging more into what I learned in Israel, which I'm really excited about. But after I got back from Israel in Sunday school, we were going through the book of Romans. I think we were in Romans at the time, but we were almost done. So after Romans, I'm like, we're going to go to the Old Testament. I'm going to go through the book of Judges with the students because so much of what I learned, like I know I can connect to things in the book of Judges. And I've loved going through the book of Judges with these kids because they remember the story so much better than they remember. At least it seems to me that they remember the story so much better than what they remember in the New Testament teachings I've done with Romans. We've done Ephesians before, and those are great books, but just the stories connect better. Right. And it's funny. So in Judges, you have this cycle going where they disobey God. He raises up a judge. The judge rescues them from whoever has captured them. And then they worship God again. And then that judge dies and they revert back to worshiping other gods and stuff in this whole cycle. And so it became a theme where like we'd read a story, like, oh, it's Israel being Israel again. I just love that they're connecting, like they're getting the bigger picture and they're remembering like right now, we're going through the story of Samson. This Sunday, actually, we'll be finishing up the story of Samson with his death there at the end of Judges 16. But like, I'll say something or we'll read something. Oh, this is like what happened in the other story, or this is like what this other judge did. And like, I just love hearing them just connect the dots. And it's great to see in this way.
It really is. And it shouldn't be intimidating for us guys that are listening. And maybe you don't know your Old Testament as well. There's resources out there. Marty, I'm sure you can point them to some of them. I mean, just lean in. It's okay to don't feel like you have to be a first century or Old Testament theologian to be able to use these stories to make the connections and to disciple, particularly for you guys listening who have kids. You can disciple your own kids. You can expose them to these stories and learn together. I think there's some beauty in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One resource that I've recently discovered is a guy by the name of Ray Vander Laan. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ray Vander Laan. No. He is so good at teaching from an Old Testament context. So I don't know his exact history. I know he spent a lot of time in Israel learning under the rabbis and the Jewish teachers there to connect a lot of the dots in the Old Testament. And so over the past few months, really, he's got a series of lectures on Spotify that I listen to. That he just connects the dots and just going through that, connecting with what I learned in Israel. I'm like, there's so much out there. And, you don't have to go to Israel. You don't have to pay all the money to go on an Israel trip to learn these things. It is out there. It is available. One of the things when we got back, so I mentioned that John gave us access to all of his notes. Included in that was a bibliography. I almost said biography, a bibliography of all these books. And it's about 4 pages of books. And there's a couple blogs and websites on there of literature that's out there to teach about reading the Bible from an ancient Near Eastern context to where, how Jews understand the Bible. One book that I have yet to read, and I really need to, it's called Our Father Abraham by, I think it's Marvin Wilson. I've heard great reviews of it about how it lays it all out, but I haven't read it yet. It's on my reading list. I'll get there.
There you go.
There's so many books out there available, and Ray Vander Laan and the lectures he gives as well.
Well, guys, lean into it. Look for his resources, first century youth ministry as well. But Marty, before we wrap up, let's have a little fun at the end. Let's do a lightning round with you, if you will, just to let the listeners get to know you a little bit more outside all the wonderful work you're doing in ministry. So you good with that?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. So what's your favorite food? What do you enjoy, Marty?
I'm a youth pastor, so it's got to be pizza.
All right, what about hobbies? What do you enjoy doing for fun?
I love to read. Reading is a great hobby of mine. I love football. I'm a big New York Jets fan, which has caused a lot of sadness in my own life. But we got Aaron Rodgers now, so we'll see how that goes.
Well, I'm trying to make the connection. How are you a Jets fan? You didn't grow up in that area, right?
That is a very good question. So when I was a kid, so I mentioned I love to read. So I got a hold of this book when I was like 4 years old. 4 or 5 years. I just learned how to read. My dad got me this book called NFL's Greatest Upsets.
Right.
And Joe Namath and the Jets back in 1968 beating the Colts. I'm like, I'm going to be a Jets fan. And I didn't know at the time how much pain and suffering that would lead to in my life because they're never good. And I'll tell you this one quick story. When I was a kid, we were watching a Jets game and they were losing bad. And I looked to my dad like, well, why don't they put Joe Namath in? That's their problem. I didn't know that Joe was about 6 years old at the time.
Oh man, I felt so bad for you guys last year was it Rodgers in the first
Yeah,
half?
he lasted 4 snaps.
Yeah.
Tore his Achilles.
Yeah. Well, there's always this year, so we'll be praying for you there, brother.
That's right. Appreciate it.
What about when you think over the last year? Where did you spend too much time? Anywhere you wasted time at?
On my phone. That's one thing that I wish I would spend less time on my phone, but it's so easy. Like you just get bored. Like,
Right.
I'll just pop my phone out. It's like there's so many more things that I could do that are more valuable with my time than spend on my phone.
100%. What about something that maybe you've been struggling with? I mean, sometimes it's so easy when people listen to podcasts, you know, particularly a leadership podcast, we hear the best of the best. And sometimes it's you can put people on pedestals. I'm sure you have items that you're working through on a regular basis. Anything that's top of the list right now?
So my mom has been through, she's got a lot of health issues. It's been lasting about 4 or 5 years now. She's been in the nursing home for 2.5 years now with mental issues. She's been diagnosed with severe OCD. And actually, about a week and a half ago, she noticed swelling on her neck, on her lip, or on her cheek, on her jaw. And so this afternoon, actually, she's getting a biopsy done to check for cancer.
Okay.
So we're in a lot of prayer over that right now. I know my dad's in a lot of, he's stressed out. Mom, of course, has been stressed out about it. But the hard thing with it is that with her mentally, she wouldn't go anywhere. She didn't want to do much. And then back in March or April, the doctors, they changed something with their medicine, and it just she was getting to be more like Mom used to be. Yeah. And it was awesome. I was home back in July. We went on a day trip up to Dubuque, Iowa, great tourist place. But it was just fun having Mom, laughing again and getting around more and wanting to do stuff and just being more like her old self. And now we got this cancer scare. It's like, man, is it going to ever let up? And it's just, that's been a struggle the last couple of years, really. Mom's declining health.
Well, I will be praying for you, Marty, and praying for her for sure. And I appreciate everything that you're doing. I mean, maybe the last question for our lightning round is what do you hope the guys listening remember the most just about everything we talked about today?
I would encourage them that when they read the New Testament, when they read the Gospels, Jesus says a lot of things that are connected to the Old Testament. Now, not everything that he says, and I was looking actually through my Bible this morning, looking for those Old Testament references because most Bibles have a footnote. But there are certain things that Jesus alludes to that there's not a footnote there. And so I would challenge you, if you're reading the Gospels, or sometimes even in the book of Acts and in the letters, and particularly in Revelation, as we were talking about earlier, look for those Old Testament connections. And it might, the Old Testament's long, it's big. The internet can help you. Sometimes just a quick Google search, what is Jesus talking about here? Look for commentaries, things like that. Because there's so much in the New Testament that can be explained better by looking at Old Testament connections. So I would encourage listeners really to do that and look into those.
100%. Well, Marty, this has been great. Where should the people go to learn more about the First Century Youth Ministries as well? And also, if they want to connect with you and the things you're doing, where do you want to send them?
So Heather's got her own website, firstcenturyyouthministry.com. That would be the best way to connect with her. There's also a Facebook page, First Century Youth Ministry, to connect with her. Now, I'm at Roskilde Church of Christ in Lima, Ohio. It's a small church. We've got our own website, roskildechurch.org. I'm also on Facebook. We're on Facebook. Youth groups on Facebook. Everything's on Facebook now.
There you go.
So look us up. I love serving at this church. It's great. So those are ways to connect with me, connect with Heather and the work that she's doing.
Well, Marty, this has been awesome. I knew this was going to be a fun one just with you, your energy when we met a few weeks ago. So excited to be able for you to be able to share your story, your testimony, and man, some amazing events. It sounds like that happened with you in Israel. So prayerfully one day, that's on my bucket list. I definitely want to get there one day. And thank you just again for everything you shared with us today.
It was my pleasure. I love doing this. This was a lot of fun.
All right, you have a great day, sir.
All right, you too, Chris. Take care.
All right, guys, I told you that was going to be a good one. Marty, he did not disappoint. I didn't know what to expect going into it. You never know sometimes, but Marty, he was just a ton of fun to work with. Highly encourage you guys just to, share this out, particularly for you guys that wanted to do some work with the youth and things like that. Share it out with others. Go get a copy of the book, First Century Youth Ministries. Go check out their resources as well. Just love everything they're doing. And as you think about moving forward, the question of our week this week was really been about how can you resist that conforming to the worldly values that are out there? Well, part of the resisting conforming could just be leaning into your scripture, going into the Old Testament and understanding it better, just having a better understanding. If we are called to be disciples when it process of sanctification, every day we need to be growing closer to Him. That means learning new things, asking the questions. They're the only bad questions we ask in church are the ones we don't ask. Like seriously, we need to be asking the questions so that we can grow to be disciples, to do what He's called us to do. So just thank you again for Marty for coming on and sharing his story. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Go to thelionwithin.us, find all our resources from our community to our YouVersion devotions, to our leadership development programs that we have out there. We have tons and tons of ways we're leaning in. We're doing what God's called us to do. And we just need you. We need you to come alongside and check us out and jump in and get started, okay? We'd love for you to be a monthly donor. If you'd like to support the show, thelionwithin.us/donate. That's how you can support the program. And then come back on Friday. We'll have some fun Friday tips for you. We're going to unpack some tips, some dad jokes, book of the week, all the normal stuff on our Fun Friday, and just to give you a little bit of boost going into your weekend. All right. So have a great day, guys. Get after it. Thank you so much for listening. Give us a rating and review if you get a chance. And remember, just keep unleashing the lion within.
House cats, go ahead and skip this message. This is for the lions, because we know that the evil one is coming at you daily, trying to steal, kill, and destroy everything in your life. We recognize that you try to face each day with strength, determination, and purpose. But even the strongest need a brotherhood behind them. At The Lion Within Us, we created an online Christians men community where we can grow, connect, and strengthen your walk with God. It's more than just a community. It truly is a brotherhood. Be warned, this is not for the faint-hearted. This is where you push your limits, growing stronger in your faith and rising above the ordinary. Here, we challenge you to become the leader God intends you to be. The time to act is now, and your 30-day free trial is waiting. No excuses, no delays. It's time to step up and join the community. Head over to thelionwithin.us. That's thelionwithin.us to get started today.